The Devil's Cabin. My name is Jack Reyes, and I'm a real estate agent. I've debated for months whether to share this story, but the few people who might recognize it have already discussed it with me at length. The story I'm about to tell you is absolutely true, though I've often wished it wasn't. It's been 3 years since I spent that night in the cabin, and every day I still wonder if something followed me home. Some nights I still wake up at 3 a.m., drenched in cold sweat, convinced I can smell that distinctive scent again. A blend of pine wood and something else, a decay-like odor I'll never forget. A smell that has no place in my city apartment 70 miles from those mountains. I used to be skeptical about paranormal stories. I'd roll my eyes at ghost hunters and their evidence. But there are things in this world we don't understand, forces we aren't meant to encounter. And sometimes they find us when we least expect it. I had just landed a job at Crestwood Properties after switching from a smaller agency. The divorce had left me financially drained. Legal fees, the house settlement, and my ex-wife's vindictive lawyer made sure of that. I needed this job to work out, and I was determined to prove myself by taking on properties other agents avoided. That's how I ended up with the cabin. "You've got the Montgomery listing," my new boss Thomas said one morning, sliding a file across his polished mahogany desk. "It's one of our most valuable properties, but it's challenging." The folder contained details about a luxury cabin previously owned by a famous rock singer from the 90s. It wasn't particularly large, but it had high-end finishes, a professional recording studio, and sat on 20 acres of pristine forest land. The asking price made my eyes widen. My commission would cover 6 months of bills if I could sell it. "What's the catch?" I asked, knowing there had to be one. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair. "It's remote, very remote. The roads are treacherous. GPS is unreliable, and it's been sitting in our portfolio for years. The previous owner kept delaying the sale, but he's finally ready to let it go." He didn't mention that every other agent had turned down the listing. I would learn that fact later. The next day, I drove to the office to meet Ryan, a senior agent who had visited the property before. "No way you'd find it on your own," he said as we loaded up his SUV. "Even with directions, the road seems to disappear in places." We drove for hours, leaving the highway for increasingly narrower roads. Eventually, we turned onto a dirt track that barely qualified as a road. The forest grew denser, the trees taller, blocking out much of the daylight. I lost cell service about an hour after we left the main highway. "No one comes out here," Ryan said, gripping the steering wheel tightly as we navigated a particularly rough patch. "That's the appeal for certain clients, I guess. Complete isolation." Something in his tone made me glance over. His knuckles were white from clutching the wheel too hard. "You don't like this place," I said. It wasn't a question. "I'm glad it's your listing now," he replied without looking at me. "It'll be a nice commission, but I hate coming up here, especially alone." He emphasized the word alone as if it were a terrible curse. When we finally arrived, I understood the appeal of the property immediately. The cabin was a masterpiece of rustic luxury, hand-hewn timber beams, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a stunning mountain view, and a wraparound porch perfect for taking in the landscape. Despite being off-grid, it had high-end appliances powered by a sophisticated generator system, satellite internet, and even the small recording studio the singer had installed. But there was something else I noticed right away: the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an absolute absence of sound that felt wrong. No bird song, no insect buzzing, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Just a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow all noise. "We need to check what needs repairs and get out before dark," Ryan said, glancing at his watch. "The road gets dangerous at night. Things seem to disappear." We worked quickly, making notes of minor issues, some weather damage to the deck, a few broken roof tiles, nothing major. The whole time Ryan kept checking his watch, growing visibly anxious as the afternoon wore on. "Let's wrap this up," he said finally. "We should leave soon." "What's the rush?" I asked, though I felt a strange unease myself. The place was beautiful but felt off somehow. like walking into a perfect photograph where something subtle has been altered. Trust me, you don't want to be on that road after sunset. Parts of it seem to vanish in the dark. And I'm not just being dramatic. I've gotten lost up here before, not fun. We finished our assessment and left before dusk. On the drive back, I contacted a contractor who agreed to handle the repairs. They could start tomorrow, but the work would take 2 days. I'll stay at the cabin to oversee everything, I decided. No point making that drive twice. Ryan shot me a concerned look. You sure that's a good idea? It's just a cabin in the woods. I'll be fine. That decision would prove to be the worst mistake of my life. The next morning, I followed the contractor's trucks up the winding road to the cabin. Even with the convoy, I noticed how the landscape seemed designed to disorient turns that looked identical landmarks that appeared multiple times. Without someone leading the way, I'd have been hopelessly lost. The contractors worked efficiently, clearly wanting to finish as much as possible before nightfall. I tried asking one of them about the area, but he just shook his head. Don't know much about it. Folks don't come up here if they can help it. Around 6:30 p.m., they started packing up their tools. The foreman approached me with an apologetic expression. We got most of it done, but we'll need to come back tomorrow to finish. We should head out now before it gets dark. I assured him I'd be fine staying alone and would see them in the morning. As their trucks disappeared down the dirt road, the silence rushed in like a physical presence. I stood on the porch, suddenly aware of how utterly alone I was. No neighbors for miles, no cell service. No one would hear me if I called for help. I shook off the thought and went inside to prepare the simple dinner I'd brought. The cabin's electricity came from a generator in a small shed behind the building, and I made a mental note to check the fuel level before bed. After eating, I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, admiring the sunset. The mountains turned purple and gold in the fading light, and for a moment I understood why someone would want a place so remote. There was a purity to the isolation, a disconnection from the chaos of modern life. That's when I noticed it. Not what was there, but what wasn't. No cricket chirps, no frogs croaking, no owls hooting as night fell. The forest was dead silent in a way that felt deeply unnatural. I also realized I hadn't seen any wildlife since arriving. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. It was as if animals avoided this area entirely. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness swallowed the forest. I was about to head inside when movement caught my eye, something pale between the trees at the edge of the property. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. A face. A woman's face, completely white, staring at me from between the trunks of 2 pines. I stood up, taking a few steps toward it, but in the deepening darkness I couldn't be sure of what I was seeing. Pareidolia, I told myself. That phenomenon where the human brain creates faces from random patterns. Just my imagination playing tricks in the twilight. I went back inside, locked the doors, and tried to focus on work I'd brought along. The generator hummed steadily outside, powering the lights and my laptop. The recording studio at the back of the cabin was the most soundproof room, so I sat up there appreciating the professional desk and comfortable chair. The silence was overwhelming. I could swear I heard my own heartbeat echoing in the room. After an hour of work, the lights began to flicker. The generator must be running low on fuel, I realized. I opened the door to head outside and check it. That's when I heard it. Laughter. A woman's laugh, distant but clear somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin. My first thought was that the contractors had returned, but that made no sense. They would have been driving for at least an hour by now, almost to town. I stepped onto the porch, peering into the blackness. "Hello, is someone there?" The laughter came again, closer this time. It wasn't joyful or friendly. There was something wrong about it, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. I strained my eyes, trying to see anything in the darkness, but it was like looking into an abyss. I remembered what I thought I'd seen earlier, the pale face watching from the trees. Had someone been there all along? I checked my phone reflexively, but as expected, there was no signal. I recalled Ryan mentioning that signal could occasionally be found about 20 minutes down the road at a particular bend. Panic began to rise in my chest. I wasn't sure what was happening, but something felt very wrong. Should I drive to where there was cell reception or all the way back to town? Or was I overreacting to what was probably just an animal of the wind? Logic told me it had to be something natural, perhaps a coyote or some other animal with a call that sounded like laughter. But a deeper instinct, something primitive and rarely accessed in our modern world, was screaming at me to run. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car, starting the engine with shaking hands. I drove down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the darkness, revealing the twisted shapes of trees that seemed to reach for the vehicle as I passed. The road was much more difficult to navigate at night, with turns that didn't seem to match my memory of the drive up. After about 15 minutes of white-knuckle driving, my phone buzzed with incoming messages. Signal. I pulled over, almost crying with relief at this tenuous connection to the outside world. I texted my colleagues, my boss, even my ex-wife, anyone, to make me feel less alone. They responded, and for a few precious minutes I felt connected to the normal world again. I sat there breathing deeply, laughing at myself for getting so spooked. Clearly the isolation and darkness had gotten to me. There was no woman in the woods, no sinister laughter. Just my imagination fueled by an admittedly creepy environment. Now I faced a choice: continue driving 4 hours back to the city, or return to the cabin for the night. The contractors would arrive early tomorrow. It was just one night. I decided to head back, feeling foolish about my panic. I turned the car around and started driving. After a few minutes, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't find the road back to the cabin. What should have been a clear path now looked like solid forest. I stopped the car, got out with a flashlight, and walked ahead to search for the road. Eventually I found it, a nearly invisible turn that somehow looked completely different in the darkness. As I drove, I noticed other turns branching off that I hadn't seen before, paths that seemed to lead nowhere. From above, this area must look like a maze designed to confuse and trap unwary travelers. When I finally arrived back at the cabin, my blood ran cold. The front door stood wide open and all the lights were off. I was certain I'd closed and locked the door, and the generator had been running when I left. Heart pounding, I cautiously approached. I checked around the exterior first, shining my flashlight across the property, but saw nothing unusual. Inside, everything seemed untouched. The generator had simply run out of fuel, explaining the darkness. I refilled it from the spare canisters in the shed and got the power running again. Trying to calm myself, I reasoned that I must not have closed the door properly and the wind had blown it open. As for the laughter, perhaps it had been a fox or coyote. Their calls can sound disturbingly human sometimes. I double-checked all the locks and tried to return to work, but couldn't concentrate. Every creak of the cabin settling made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. Around 3 a.m., exhaustion finally won out over fear. I decided to try getting some sleep in the recording studio. It had the sturdiest door and no windows. I gathered a blanket and pillow, filled a glass of water, and was just about to close myself in for the night when a sound made me drop the glass. The car alarm was blaring outside. I ran to the window, heart hammering against my ribs. In the flashing lights from my car, I saw a figure running toward the trees. A woman, or at least something shaped like a woman, wearing what appeared to be a long dress or robe. But there was something profoundly wrong about the way she moved. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Her knees bent backwards like a dog's hind legs. I stood frozen, watching until the alarm stopped automatically. Then I stationed myself by the door, too terrified to move. I didn't know what I'd seen, but I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't human. With the first rays of dawn came the sound of an approaching vehicle, an old, loud truck engine I could hear from a distance. One of yesterday's workers arrived, accompanied by several locals they'd hired to help finish the job. One of them noticed my exhausted appearance and bloodshot eyes. "You won't sleep well staying alone up here," he said matter-of-factly, as if this were common knowledge. I wanted to ask more, but they quickly got to work. At lunch break, I found myself sitting with the 3 local men they'd brought along. Throwing caution to the wind, I told them what I'd experienced. The face in the forest, the laughter, the woman with the backwards bending knees. They didn't laugh or look skeptical. Instead, they exchanged knowing glances, their expressions grave. "You've seen La Dama," one of them said quietly. "The lady." "She's not the only thing in these mountains," added another. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. These men weren't humoring me or sharing ghost stories. They were deadly serious. Then I remembered something. My car had a dash cam that recorded when it detected motion. If something had triggered my car alarm, the camera might have captured it. The thought of having actual evidence both terrified and excited me. As soon as I returned to the office, I asked our IT specialist to check the footage. He claimed the camera wasn't working, but I knew that was a lie. We checked the systems regularly. He promised to recover the footage, but something in his evasive manner made me suspect I would never see it. Over the next few days, I threw myself into other properties trying to forget the unsettling experience. Then my boss called me into his office. "Someone's interested in the cabin," Thomas said. "I want you to take Jason with you to show it. Good experience for him." Jason was Thomas's son, a bright 19-year-old who was learning the business. Despite his nepotistic entry into the company, I had to admit he was smart and hard-working. I was relieved not to return to the cabin alone. Though I didn't dare tell Thomas about my experiences, I'd sound crazy or worse, incompetent. What I didn't know then was that this return trip would plunge us both into a nightmare far worse than anything I'd experienced that first night. A nightmare that would reveal secrets about the mountain, the cabin, and even my own company that I could never have imagined. And it would bring us face to face with something that should never have existed in our world. But as I packed extra fuel for the generator, a hunting knife that had belonged to my father, and even a small blessed crucifix I'd borrowed from my mother's collection, I had no idea that what waited for us in those mountains wasn't just a local legend or a strange phenomenon. It was a gateway to something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting a very long time for us to arrive. Part 2. The Escalation. 2 weeks after my unsettling night at the cabin, Thomas called me into his office with news that made my stomach drop. "We have a serious buyer for the Montgomery cabin," he announced, leaning back in his executive chair. "They want a viewing tomorrow. I need you to take Jason along. Good training opportunity." I kept my expression neutral despite the cold dread spreading through me. "Of course. Not a problem." "Great. You'll stay overnight since we have another potential buyer scheduled for the following day. The roads are treacherous, so I'm lending you my Range Rover. No excuses for missing either appointment." Arguing would only raise questions I couldn't answer. How could I explain the woman with backwards bending knees, the disembodied laughter? I'd sound insane. That night I prepared meticulously. I packed extra fuel for the generator flashlights with spare batteries and a hunting knife that had belonged to my father. I also borrowed my mother's prized possession, a small crucifix blessed at the Vatican. She would have killed me if she knew, but something told me I needed all the protection I could get. The next morning, Jason picked me up in his father's imposing Range Rover. Tall and lean, with Thomas's confident jawline, the 19-year-old carried himself with the easy assurance of someone who'd never known real hardship. Still, I liked him. Unlike other privileged kids, Jason worked hard and treated people with respect. "Dad says this place is incredible but remote," he said as we left the highway. "Is it really as isolated as they say?" "More," I replied, watching civilization gradually disappear behind us. GPS fails, cell service vanishes, and the road, sometimes it seems to change. Jason laughed. "Sounds like the perfect setting for a horror movie." "Yeah," I said quietly. "Perfect." I directed him through increasingly narrow roads until we reached the dirt track leading to the cabin. The weather had been clear when we left the city, but as we approached the mountains, dark clouds gathered above us. A storm was brewing. Man, this really is in the middle of nowhere, Jason commented as we navigated the rough terrain. No wonder they're asking so much total privacy. I nodded, my attention divided between guiding Jason and scanning the dense forest surrounding us. Every shadow between the trees seemed to conceal watchful eyes. Every rustling branch made me flinch. When we reached the area where cell service briefly appeared, I had Jason stop the car. I tied a bright orange ribbon to a tree branch. "What's that for?" he asked. "In case of emergency," I explained. "This is the only spot within miles with any reception. If anything happens, head here." "What could happen?" Jason looked bemused. "Bears," I forced a smile. "Just a precaution?" As we approached the cabin, light rain began to fall. The structure looked different in the gray daylight, less welcoming, more imposing, like something watching us arrive. Inside, the contractors had done excellent work. Everything was pristine, ready for potential buyers. But the moment we stepped through the door, something felt wrong. An inexplicable sensation of being unwelcome, of trespassing. Jason felt it too. He stopped abruptly in the entryway, his expression confused. "Does it feel strange in here to you?" he asked quietly. "Like someone's watching us," I supplied. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, exactly like that." We inspected every room, every closet, even checked under furniture. Logically, the cabin was empty, yet the feeling persisted. Someone or something was here with us. The scheduled buyers arrived an hour later in a sleek black Lexus SUV. I expected a wealthy couple, perhaps a tech executive seeking a secluded retreat. Instead, two people emerged, a stern-looking man in his 40s dressed like an accountant, and a petite woman in her 20s whose sharp eyes and commanding presence made her the obvious authority despite her youth. "I'm Eliza Chen." The woman introduced herself with a firm handshake. "This is Mr. Weiss. Our employer is very interested in this property but couldn't come personally. We're here to verify it meets certain specifications." They were oddly formal, more like inspectors than typical clients. Eliza's tailored pantsuit and immaculate bob seemed wildly impractical for a mountain property viewing. "Of course," I said, leading them inside. "I'd be happy to show you all the features." To my surprise, they spent barely 5 minutes touring the cabin's interior. No questions about the high-end appliances, the recording studio, or the custom woodwork. Instead, Weiss wandered into the woods, while Eliza asked to see the location of the septic tank, an unusual request that raised immediate red flags. "The property has 20 acres, I explained, pointing to a weathered trail. "The septic system is about 50 yards that way." "I'd like to see it," she insisted. I escorted her through the drizzling rain, increasingly bewildered by her priorities. When we reached the tank, she merely glanced at it before staring intently at the surrounding forest as if searching for something specific. Back at the cabin, Jason and I waited on the porch while our visitors conducted their bizarre inspection. The rain intensified, yet they seemed unbothered by getting soaked. "Something's off about these people," Jason whispered. "Who asks about septic tanks but ignores a professional recording studio?" "I know," I agreed. "It's like they're not really here for the cabin at all." Jason's attention drifted to the tree line. "That's weird. Does that look like a woman standing there to you?" I followed his gaze and felt my blood freeze. Between two massive pines stood the pale face I'd seen during my previous visit, a woman's face white as marble watching us with unblinking eyes. "It's just an optical illusion," I said automatically, though I knew better. "Branches and shadows playing tricks. No, there's definitely—" Jason stopped mid-sentence as the face turned sideways and disappeared into the forest. Before we could process what we'd seen, Weiss emerged from the opposite direction, calling to Eliza that he'd found it, whatever it was. Eliza joined him, they conferred briefly, then approached us. "We've seen enough," Eliza announced. "Our employer will be in touch with your company." "Is there anything specific you liked about the property?" I asked, attempting to salvage some normalcy from this strange encounter. "The location is suitable," she replied cryptically. "Mr. Montoya will contact your office directly." They returned to their Lexus and drove away, leaving us perplexed on the porch as thunder rumbled in the distance. What the hell was that about? Jason wondered aloud. They didn't even look at the cabin features. I have no idea, I admitted, though dread was building in my chest. Something about their inspection felt ritualistic rather than practical. The storm intensified as evening approached. Jason, restless and eager to contact his girlfriend, decided to jog to the cell service spot I'd marked earlier. "I'll be back in 20 minutes, he promised, donning a rain jacket and tucking the hunting knife I'd brought into his pocket. "Just need to check in with Amber." I watched anxiously as he disappeared down the muddy road. The rain fell harder, drumming against the cabin roof like impatient fingers. 1 hour passed, then 2. No sign of Jason. Panic clawed at my throat. I was about to take the Range Rover and search for him when I heard a sound from behind the cabin, a deep, guttural bellowing unlike any animal I recognized. It was followed by the cracking of branches, as if something massive was moving through the trees. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously circled the building. The beam caught movement, not Jason, but what appeared to be a large shadow retreating into the forest. Whatever it was stood at least 8 feet tall. Heart racing, I moved the Range Rover closer to the cabin steps, ensuring a quick escape if needed. As darkness fell completely, the rain eased to a steady patter. I peered through the windows, scanning the property edge. What I saw turned my blood to ice. Not one, but multiple figures moving among the trees, circling the cabin like predators. I counted 5 distinct silhouettes, some short, others tall, methodically pacing, never approaching too closely, but never leaving either. The motion sensor light outside suddenly activated. In its harsh glare stood a bearded man wearing what appeared to be a crown of thorns, blood trickling down his forehead. He wore a long white robe and stared directly at the cabin with hollow eyes. When the light flashed on, he retreated 2 steps back into shadows. At that moment I heard an approaching vehicle and feared our strange visitors had returned. Instead, I recognized the rattling engine of the local contractor's pickup truck. Relief washed over me until I saw Jason in the back seat, deathly pale, his eyes wide with terror. I ran outside to meet them, but Jason rushed past me, entering the cabin without a word. The local workers parked nose out, clearly positioning for a quick departure. They hurried inside, immediately checking all windows and turning off most lights, leaving only the entrance light on. "Does the generator have enough fuel for the night?" one asked urgently. I nodded, confusion and fear battling within me. "What's happening? Where did you find Jason?" They signaled for silence and ushered us all into the recording studio, closing the door but leaving it cracked open to listen for outside sounds. We sat in near darkness, the tension palpable. "We found him on the road, panicked, saying something was chasing him," one worker whispered. "Lucky we were coming to check on you." "Check on me, why?" "We saw cars heading up here that shouldn't be," he explained. "People who don't belong." A soft knocking at the front door silenced our conversation. I felt my heart stop, then race forward at double speed. Nobody moved. The knocking came again, more insistent. Despite the workers' frantic gestures to stay put, I crawled out of the studio. I had to see who or what was there. Keeping low, I crept to a position where I could view the front door. The porch light had gone out. I peered through a narrow window, trying to make out shapes in the darkness. The knocking continued, but something was wrong about the sound. It wasn't made by knuckles on wood, but something harder, less human. I moved cautiously across the living room toward another window with a better view of the porch. Halfway across, I looked up and froze. Through the window, a face was staring in a woman's face with an impossibly wide grin and eyes that seemed too large, too empty. She was trying to push her head through a small gap where the window hadn't closed properly. I screamed. Later, the others told me it was the most terrifying sound they'd ever heard. All I remember is somehow crawling back to the studio. My hands scraped raw splinters embedded in my palms. Half an hour passed before I could speak coherently. One of the workers ventured out to check and returned with surprising news. "They're gone, for now." We cautiously emerged. Dawn was breaking the gray light filtering through the trees. Jason remained almost catatonic, shivering despite the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "What happened to him?" I asked the workers. "Same thing that happened to you," one replied grimly. "He saw her." Through the windows I could see figures moving among the distant trees, but they were retreating, walking with an unnatural slowness, as if time meant nothing to them. One figure, unmistakably the woman I'd seen at the window, wore what appeared to be a black robe with gold embroidery, reminiscent of a perverted version of a religious icon. Suddenly a question occurred to me. "Why are you here?" I asked the workers. "If you know this place is dangerous, why come up at night?" Their explanation was both simple and chilling. The town residents monitored vehicles heading up the mountain. After seeing our arrival, they became concerned when strange SUVs followed the same route, vehicles with darkly tinted windows that had never been seen in the area before. "Those buyers who came to see the cabin," one worker explained. "When they returned to town, their Lexus was damaged, scratched, covered in dirt branches, stuck in the grill. The engine was overheating like an old clunker, though it was nearly new. They stopped for repairs in town." The man appeared traumatized, barely able to speak. When asked what happened, he claimed an animal had forced them off the road and chased their vehicle for miles. "What kind of animal?" one of the mechanics had asked, skeptical. "There aren't many deer left in these parts." "We were driving normally when it jumped in front of us," the man had replied, growing agitated. "It walked on two legs, but it wasn't a person. Wasn't a woman, though it looked like one. But its face, its muzzle." The locals didn't need further explanation. They knew the legends about what roamed these mountains after dark. But what truly alarmed them were the three identical black SUVs with heavily tinted windows that headed up the mountain after the Lexus left. This kind of vehicle hadn't been seen in the area for at least a year. When Jason appeared on the road, terrified and babbling about being chased, they knew they needed to return to the cabin immediately. "Who were they?" I asked. "The people in the black SUVs." The workers exchanged glances. "We don't know exactly," one finally answered. "But they come up here for a reason, and it's not about buying property." As the morning light strengthened, Jason gradually became more coherent. He explained that while jogging to the cell reception spot, he'd sensed something following him. When he turned around, he saw a dark shape moving between the trees. "I started running," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But it moved so fast, faster than any person could run. I was lucky to meet these guys on the road." I asked if he'd seen what was chasing him, but he shook his head. "Not clearly, just a shape. But I felt it. I knew it wasn't human." Around noon we heard vehicles approaching. My heart sank, fearing our strange visitors had returned. Instead, two black Range Rovers appeared identical to the one Thomas had loaned us. A short man with a military-style buzz cut emerged from the first vehicle. "Mr. Reyes," he called, his voice surprisingly friendly, despite his intimidating appearance. I approached cautiously. "Yes. Our employer is extremely interested in this property," he stated without introduction. "We're here to verify certain aspects." He signaled to the second vehicle, and two more men stepped out, broad-shouldered individuals who moved with the practiced efficiency of security personnel. The buzz-cut man turned toward the second Range Rover, where someone lowered the window slightly. After a brief exchange, he nodded, and the two security men headed into the forest without another word. "My associates will conduct the inspection," Buzzcut explained with a thin smile. "Don't you want to see the interior?" I asked, increasingly confused by these bizarre property viewings. "That won't be necessary. All the pertinent details have been arranged." Jason remained on the porch, still pale and disoriented. Buzzcut noticed him and approached. "Is he all right?" he asked, his tone oddly aggressive. "He's fine," I answered quickly. "Just feeling a bit under the weather." Buzzcut stared at Jason intently, then continued walking around the property as if conducting his own assessment. Through the studio window, I watched him kick at the floorboards, testing their solidity or searching for something beneath them. When he returned, his demeanor had changed. The fake friendliness was gone, replaced by cold efficiency. "My employer will handle the purchase details directly with your office," he stated. "The signal up here is terrible, but there's enough at the bend in the road to make calls." I was stunned. "You're making an offer without even entering the cabin." "We know everything we need to know," he replied cryptically, then lowered his voice. "Word of advice, get out of here. Take your commission and forget this place. You don't want any part of this." A whistle came from the forest. One of the security men had returned, and Buzzcut walked over to him. They spoke briefly, then the security man handed something to Buzzcut. He returned to us, holding my mother's crucifix, now covered in dirt as if it had been buried. It looked older, weathered, almost deformed, despite having been in my possession just yesterday. "Did one of you lose this?" he asked, holding it out. "It's mine," I said, reaching for it. He moved uncomfortably close, his voice dropping to an unsettling whisper. "Be careful where you leave these things around here." His breath smelled of cigarettes and something metallic as he continued, "Leave now. I don't want to see you again. My employer is handling everything for the purchase. The air up here is no good for you." They departed shortly after, accelerating down the mountain road like they were fleeing a crime scene. The window of the second Range Rover lowered briefly as they turned, and I caught a glimpse of an elderly man with silver hair watching us with unsettling intensity. "What the hell is going on?" Jason asked once they'd gone. "First those weird buyers yesterday. Now these guys, none of them even looked at the cabin." I shook my head. "I don't know, but we're leaving. Now." We quickly gathered our belongings, thanked the local workers for their help, and got into Thomas's Range Rover. As I started the engine, my phone rang. Thomas was calling. "Jack, great news. We have 2 solid offers on the Montgomery property. The second buyer just contacted me directly. They're offering well above asking price, all cash. Close the deal." "Thomas, something strange is happening up here," I began, but he cut me off. "Whatever it is, handle it. This is the sale of the year. Don't mess this up." He hung up before I could respond. I looked at Jason, who had overheard the conversation. "We can't just leave," he said reluctantly. "Dad will kill me if we blow this sale." I gripped the steering wheel, torn between self-preservation and professional obligation. "Fine. We'll stay until tomorrow, meet the other potential buyer, then get the hell out of here." We returned to the cabin where the local workers were preparing to leave. They seemed shocked by our decision to stay. "After everything that happened last night?" one asked incredulously. "It's complicated," I replied. "But we won't be alone. There's 3 of you plus us." They exchanged looks before the oldest, a weathered man named Eduardo, spoke up. "We cannot stay. We have families waiting. But we will return at first light tomorrow." Before they left, I pulled Eduardo aside. "What's really happening here? What was that thing I saw last night?" He glanced nervously at the forest. "We call her La Dama, the lady. The old ones say she came through the door many years ago. Not a ghost, not a demon, something older." "What door?" Eduardo pointed toward the mountain peak visible beyond the trees. "There is a cave high up. Inside is what the ancients called a doorway between worlds. Those who know stay away. Those who don't—" He trailed off, making the sign of the cross. "Just survive the night, lock everything. Don't look out the windows after dark." With that ominous advice, they departed, leaving Jason and me alone in the increasingly oppressive silence of the cabin. We secured every window, checked every lock, and prepared for another night in what I now understood was far more than just an isolated property. As the sun began to set, Jason broke our tense silence. "I'm going to get my medallion," he announced suddenly. "What medallion?" I asked, confused. "The St. Christopher medal my grandmother gave me before she died. I was wearing it yesterday when that thing chased me. It must have fallen off in the forest. I need to find it." "Jason, no," I protested. "It's almost dark. Whatever's out there, It protected me, he insisted, his eyes wide and desperate. I need it. I need it back. Before I could stop him, he grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside. I called after him, but he disappeared into the growing darkness, leaving me alone in the cabin that now felt more like a trap than a shelter. I paced anxiously, checking my watch every few minutes. 15 minutes passed, then 30. No sign of Jason. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky as night claimed the mountain once again. That's when I heard a deep, guttural bellowing from the forest, the same sound I'd heard the previous night. But this time it was followed by a human scream. Jason. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and the hunting knife, rushing into the darkness after him. As I plunged into the forest, I felt the mountain's presence all around me, ancient, aware, and hungry. I had no idea that what awaited me in those woods would forever change my understanding of reality, or that the true horror of the Devil's Cabin was only just beginning to reveal itself. Part 3: Secrets from the Dark Mountain. The forest swallowed me whole. Branches clawed at my face as I ran, calling Jason's name into the suffocating darkness. My flashlight beam bounced wildly through the trees, creating monstrous shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The rain had stopped, but heavy moisture dripped from the canopy above, each cold drop hitting my skin like an accusatory finger. Jason. My voice sounded small against the vastness of the mountain wilderness. No answer except distant thunder rolling across the peaks. I stumbled forward, disoriented by the identical trees and shifting terrain. The mountain itself seemed determined to confuse me, leading me in circles, despite my attempts to maintain direction. Every landmark looked familiar yet wrong, like déjà vu twisted into a nightmare. The bellowing sound had stopped, and the absence of noise was somehow worse. I froze, straining to hear anything: Jason's voice, footsteps, even the growl of whatever had made that ungodly sound. Nothing, just the hammering of my own heart and the rasp of my breathing. Something white flashed between distant trees. I swung my flashlight toward it, but it was gone. Then again to my right, a pale figure darting through the underbrush. Jason, I called, hope battling terror in my chest. A woman's laughter answered the same chilling sound I'd heard on my first night at the cabin. Close, too close. I spun around, knife raised defensively, and found myself face to face with emptiness. The laughter came again, now from behind me. I whirled, but again saw nothing. It was toying with me. In my panic, I lost my footing on the slick forest floor and tumbled down a steep embankment, my flashlight flying from my grip. I landed hard at the bottom, pain shooting through my shoulder. Above, the laughter intensified no longer. Just one voice, but several, a chorus of inhuman mirth surrounding me in the darkness. My flashlight had landed several yards away, its beam illuminating a bizarre sight. A small clearing where the ground had been deliberately cleared of vegetation. At its center stood a crude altar made of stacked stones. Surrounding it were small objects I couldn't immediately identify. I crawled toward the light, each movement sending fresh pain through my injured shoulder. When I reached the flashlight and directed it properly at the altar, I recoiled in horror. The objects surrounding it were dolls, dozens of them made from twigs bound with human hair. Each had a face crudely carved into a central knot in the wood. Some wore tiny scraps of fabric. Others were adorned with teeth, both animal and unmistakably human. As I stared at this macabre collection, the laughter abruptly ceased. The silence that followed felt physical, pressing against my eardrums like I'd descended deep underwater. Then came a new sound: footsteps approaching through the underbrush. Heavy, deliberate steps, not Jason's. I scrambled backward, extinguishing the flashlight. Complete darkness enveloped me as I pressed myself against the embankment, willing myself to become invisible. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. Though I couldn't see, I sensed someone or something standing there, scanning the darkness. I held my breath, pain forgotten in the overwhelming need to remain undetected. A match flared momentarily, illuminating a human figure. In that brief flash, I glimpsed a bearded man in dark clothing. He lit a candle placed atop the altar, then began arranging something around it. I needed to move to find Jason, but I was trapped. Any movement would reveal my position. I remained frozen, watching as the man performed what appeared to be a ritual, murmuring words in a language I didn't recognize. When he finished, he extinguished the candle and departed the way he'd come, leaving me once again in perfect darkness. I waited until his footsteps faded completely before daring to move. Switching my flashlight back on, I climbed the embankment and oriented myself using the distant peak Eduardo had indicated. If Jason had been searching for his medallion, he might have headed toward the cell reception point where he'd lost it. As I made my way in that direction, the forest gradually thinned, and I found myself on a ridgeline overlooking a deep ravine. Across the gap rose another mountainside, and nestled in its face was the dark mouth of a cave. Even from this distance, something about it seemed wrong, the darkness within too absolute, too consuming. Movement below caught my attention. In the ravine, barely visible in the darkness, stood people, not 5 or 6, but dozens of them. They formed concentric circles around what appeared to be the entrance to another smaller cave at the ravine's base. The inner circle consisted of 13 figures in red robes. Around them stood 21 people in black, and beyond them more circles of observers. I dimmed my flashlight and crouched lower, straining to see details. Torches illuminated the scene with flickering orange light, casting massive shadows against the ravine walls. In the innermost circle, a central figure raised his arms. Even from this distance, I recognized the distinctive silver hair of the man I'd glimpsed in the Range Rover earlier. "Jack." The whispered voice nearly stopped my heart. I spun around, knife raised, to find Jason crouching behind a boulder nearby. "Jesus Christ!" I breathed, lowering the knife. "You scared the hell out of me." His face was streaked with dirt and scratches his eyes wide with terror. "We have to go! Now! What happened to you? I heard screaming." "I found my medallion," he said, his voice trembling. "But then I saw them. They're everywhere in these woods, Jack, and they're not human." Before I could question him further, a deep, rhythmic chanting began to rise from the ravine. We both turned to watch as the circles of people began to move, the inner circle clockwise, the next counterclockwise, each ring rotating in opposite directions to the ones adjacent. "What the hell is this?" Jason whispered. "I think it's some kind of ritual," I replied, remembering Eduardo's words about a doorway between worlds. As the chanting intensified, the participants moved faster. From the mouth of the small cave emerged 2 men dragging what appeared to be a burlap sack. They approached the center of the circles and emptied the sack's contents, a bound and gagged man who fell to the ground, struggling against his restraints. "They're going to kill him!" Jason gasped. I grabbed his arm. "We can't help him. There are too many of them. But we need to get back to the cabin, call for help." Reluctantly, Jason nodded, and we began to retreat from our vantage point. We'd barely taken 3 steps when a woman's laugh, that same terrible laugh, erupted from directly behind us. We turned in unison to find ourselves face to face with La Dama. In the dim light, her features were horrifyingly clear skin, white as bone stretched too tight over an angular skull, eyes black and depthless mouth fixed in a rictus smile that extended unnaturally far across her face. She wore a black robe with gold embroidery reminiscent of religious iconography, but perverted somehow, the symbols twisted into obscene configurations. Most disturbing were her legs, visible beneath the hem of her robe. They bent backward at the knee, giving her the appearance of a human form, constructed by something that had only a passing familiarity with human anatomy. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Jason ahead of me. We crashed through the underbrush, no longer concerned with stealth. Behind us came not the sound of pursuit, but that terrible laughter, now joined by other voices, a chorus of inhuman mirth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I had no idea if we were heading in the right direction. All sense of orientation had abandoned me. We simply ran, driven by pure animal terror, until Jason suddenly skidded to a halt. "Look!" he gasped, pointing ahead. Through the trees, headlights cut through the darkness, vehicles on what must be the road to the cabin. Without hesitation, we charged toward them, emerging from the forest just as a convoy of black SUVs passed by. "Help!" Jason shouted, waving his arms frantically. The last vehicle, a battered pickup truck, screeched to a halt. The window rolled down to reveal Eduardo's weathered face. "Get in!" he shouted. "Quickly!" We didn't need to be told twice. We piled into the truck bed, and Eduardo accelerated immediately, tires spinning in the mud before gaining traction. "What are you doing here?" I asked through the open rear window. "Saving your lives, it seems," Eduardo replied grimly. "I knew you should not have stayed. Tonight is the night of the ritual." "We saw it," Jason said, "in the ravine. There were people in circles, and they had a prisoner." "Not people," Eduardo corrected. "Not all of them, anyway." We held on tightly as the truck navigated the treacherous mountain road. When we reached the cabin, the black SUVs were already parked outside. Men in dark clothing moved purposefully around the property, some carrying equipment toward the forest. Eduardo drove past without stopping. "Wait," I protested. "The cabin is not safe," he said firmly. "We go to the village. You will be protected there." The village turned out to be little more than a cluster of homes on the outskirts of the nearest town, Pinecrest. Eduardo led us to a small house where several other local men had gathered, including the workers who'd helped at the cabin. They appeared to be arming themselves with hunting rifles and shotguns. Inside, an elderly woman gave us blankets and hot coffee. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the mug. "Now," Eduardo said, sitting across from us, "tell us exactly what you saw." We described everything: the circles of people, the prisoner, the silver-haired man leading the ritual. When we mentioned La Dama, several men made the sign of the cross. "What is she?" I asked. "What's happening on that mountain?" Eduardo exchanged glances with the others before responding. "The cave you saw. The locals have known about it for generations. The indigenous people called it the mouth that should not open. They performed rituals to keep it sealed, not to invite anything out. But these people, the ones in the circles, they call themselves the Gatekeepers." Eduardo continued. "They believe they can control what comes through the gate, use it for power. They have been coming here for decades, buying land, performing rituals. Sometimes people disappear. Like the prisoner we saw," Jason said quietly. Eduardo nodded solemnly. "They need sacrifices to open the gate wider. But 5 years ago, something went wrong. Their ritual brought something through that they couldn't control." "La Dama," I whispered. "Yes, she is not a ghost or a demon as you might understand them. The old stories say she is one of los que vinieron antes, those who came before, beings that ruled this world long before humans existed. And now she's here," Jason said, "walking around in our world." "Not just her," one of the other men interjected. "There are others, different shapes, different forms. Some can take people, wear them like clothing." A chill ran through me as I remembered the bizarre behavior of our clients, the way they moved their unnatural interest in the property. The buyers, I realized aloud. They weren't interested in the cabin, they wanted access to the gate. "Yes," Eduardo confirmed. "Some are true believers who think these beings will give them power. Others are already taken possessed by whatever has come through." "How do you know all this?" Jason asked. "Because we have been fighting them," Eduardo replied. "For generations, families in this area have protected the mountain. We cannot seal the gate completely. That knowledge was lost when the indigenous people were driven away. But we can limit the damage, prevent larger incursions." "Is that why you came to the cabin that night?" I asked. "To protect us?" Eduardo nodded. "We monitor vehicles going up the mountain. When we saw 3 identical black SUVs following shortly after you, we knew something was happening. Those vehicles belong to the inner circle of the Gatekeepers." Including my father, Jason said quietly. All eyes turned to him. What? I asked, stunned. I recognized his handwriting in a notebook one of those men dropped. Jason explained, his voice hollow. And then I saw him in one of the SUVs. My father is part of this cult. Silence fell over the room, heavy with implications. If Thomas was involved with the Gatekeepers, it explained why our company repeatedly handled properties in remote areas they were acquiring access points to other gates. What happens now? I finally asked. What are they trying to do tonight? Eduardo's expression darkened. Tonight is Sangre de Luna, blood moon. According to the old stories, it is when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. They will attempt to open the gate completely, permanently. And if they succeed, then what you saw, La Dama, the others will be just the beginning. More will come through. Many more. We have to stop them, Jason said, standing abruptly. How? I demanded. There are dozens of them and they have weapons. We're just real estate agents, for God's sake. But we know about the ritual, Jason insisted. We can disrupt it somehow. Eduardo and the others exchanged glances again. There seemed to be an unspoken communication passing between them. There is another ritual, Eduardo finally said. One to close the gate, not just temporarily but permanently. Then let's do that, I said. It requires sacrifice, Eduardo replied grimly. A willing sacrifice. The room fell silent again as the implication sank in. Someone has to die, Jason asked in a horrified whisper. Someone must give themselves to the gate, Eduardo clarified. It is the only way to seal it forever. Before anyone could respond, the door burst open. A young man rushed in, breathless and wide-eyed with panic. They're coming, he gasped. 3 SUVs heading into town. Eduardo immediately began issuing orders in rapid Spanish. The men grabbed their weapons and moved with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves at windows and doors. Take them to the cellar, Eduardo instructed an elderly man, gesturing to Jason and me. No, I protested, we can help. You cannot fight what you do not understand, Eduardo replied sternly. If they find you, they will kill you or worse. With no choice, we followed the old man through the kitchen to a hidden trapdoor beneath a worn rug. The cellar below was small but clean-lined with preserves and emergency supplies. The old man left us with a kerosene lamp and strict instructions not to make a sound. Through the floorboards above, we could hear the men preparing for conflict. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation and fear. My father, Jason said suddenly, his voice barely audible, if he's with them. I placed a hand on his shoulder. We don't know that. He might not be involved in tonight's ritual. Jason didn't appear convinced, but he nodded anyway. We sat in silence as minutes stretched into an hour. Occasionally we heard movement above hushed conversations in Spanish that I couldn't understand. But no sounds of conflict, no indication that the gatekeepers had found us. Finally, the trapdoor opened. Eduardo peered down at us, his expression grim. They have gone, he said, but not before searching several houses. They are looking for you. We climbed back into the kitchen where several men were gathered around a radio, listening to crackling transmissions. What's happening? I asked. Our lookouts report increased activity at the cave, Eduardo explained. The ritual has begun. Jason paced nervously. We have to do something. We can't just let them open that gate. My men are preparing, Eduardo assured him. We have disrupted their rituals before. But you said tonight is special, I pointed out. The blood moon. What if your usual methods aren't enough? Eduardo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he retrieved an old leather-bound book from a nearby shelf and placed it on the table. This contains the ritual to seal the gate, he said, passed down through generations. We have never used it because of the cost, but perhaps tonight. I opened the book carefully. The pages were fragile, filled with handwritten text in Spanish and crude diagrams depicting the cave and various symbols. Though I couldn't read the language, the illustrations made the ritual's nature clear. It required someone to enter the gate, willingly sealing it from within. You're talking about suicide, Jason said bluntly. Sacrifice, Eduardo corrected. There is a difference. A commotion outside interrupted our discussion. One of the lookouts burst in panic etched across his face. They have hostages, he announced. At least 6 people being taken to the cave. More sacrifices, Eduardo muttered, then turned to his men. We move now. Prepare the trucks. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Weapons were distributed, plans formulated. Jason and I were given shotguns despite our protests that we barely knew how to use them. Point and pull the trigger, Eduardo instructed tersely. Aim for the body, not the head. Will that even work on things like La Dama? I asked. No, he admitted. For those we have these. He handed each of us a small pouch. Salt blessed by a priest mixed with sacred herbs. It will not kill them, but it may slow them down. Outside, a convoy of pickup trucks and SUVs had assembled. The locals had clearly prepared for this eventuality, organizing themselves with military precision. You two ride with me, Eduardo said, leading us to his truck. Stay close. Do exactly as I say. We nodded, adrenaline overriding fear. As we climbed into the vehicle, I noticed the sky had cleared, revealing a full moon tinged with an unnatural reddish hue, the blood moon. The drive back up the mountain was tense and silent. Eduardo took an unmarked side road I hadn't noticed before, explaining it was an old logging path that would bring us closer to the ravine without alerting the gatekeepers. When we could drive no further, we continued on foot. About 20 locals moved through the forest with surprising stealth, communicating with hand signals. Jason and I struggled to keep up, constantly tripping over roots and underbrush. As we approached the ravine, a deep rhythmic chanting became audible. Eduardo signaled for us to drop to our stomachs and crawl the final distance to the ridge. The scene below was even more horrifying than before. The concentric circles of participants had grown, now numbering well over 100. In the center, Thomas, Jason's father, stood in an elaborate red robe reading from an ancient text. Around him, 13 hooded figures held torches aloft, illuminating the mouth of the small cave. Before the cave entrance, 6 people knelt with their hands bound behind their backs. Even from this distance, their terror was palpable. Dad, Jason whispered, his voice breaking. We're too late, Eduardo murmured. The final ritual has begun. As if confirming his words, the chanting suddenly intensified. Thomas raised a ceremonial dagger above his head, its blade gleaming in the torchlight. The inner circle began to spin faster, creating a blur of movement around him. Now, Eduardo commanded. The locals rose as one, firing rifles into the air and shouting to create maximum disruption. Several threw objects I later identified as homemade smoke bombs into the ravine, instantly creating chaos among the outer circles of participants. Eduardo led our group down a steep path into the ravine itself. In the confusion, we managed to reach the prisoners before the gatekeepers could reorganize. While the locals engaged the cult members, Jason and I cut the hostages free, urging them toward the escape route Eduardo had shown us. Throughout the melee, I kept scanning for Thomas, but he had disappeared. The inner circle members fought viciously to maintain their positions, revealing inhuman strength and resilience. One took 3 shotgun blasts to the chest before finally falling. They're possessed, Eduardo shouted. Use the pouches. I tore open the small bag he'd given me and flung its contents at an approaching cultist. The effect was immediate and disturbing. His skin seemed to bubble and smoke where the mixture touched it. He screamed in a voice that couldn't possibly have come from human vocal cords, then collapsed. The battle raged around us as we fought to reach the cave entrance. Eduardo believed that disrupting the ritual at its focal point would prevent the gate from opening completely. We were within yards of our goal when everything changed. A deafening crack split the air like the sound of the earth itself breaking apart. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and from the cave mouth emerged a darkness deeper than night, a void that seemed to consume light itself. The fighting stopped as all present turned toward this phenomenon. From within the darkness emerged a figure I recognized immediately, La Dama, but transformed. She stood at least 8 feet tall, her body elongated and wrong in ways that defied description. Behind her, other shapes began to materialize, twisted approximations of human forms with too many limbs or features in impossible configurations. "The gate is opening," Eduardo said, horror evident in his voice. "We're too late." Thomas reappeared standing before La Dama with his arms outstretched in welcome. "The way is prepared," he proclaimed. "The Masters return to claim what was always theirs." La Dama reached out one impossibly long arm and placed her hand on Thomas's head. "What happened next will haunt me until the day I die." Thomas's body began to collapse in on itself as if his skeleton were being removed piece by piece while his skin remained intact. His scream transformed into a gurgling sound as his form distorted, twisted, and finally crumpled to the ground like an empty suit. "Dad!" Jason's anguished cry cut through the horrified silence. He broke from our group, running toward where his father had fallen. "Jason, no!" I shouted, chasing after him. La Dama turned her attention to Jason, her grotesque approximation of a smile widening impossibly. She reached for him with those terrible, elongated fingers. I tackled Jason just as her hand passed through the space where his head had been. We rolled across the rocky ground, coming to a stop near the cave entrance. The book Eduardo had shown us had fallen from my pocket and lay open on the ground between us. In that moment I understood what needed to be done. "The ritual," I gasped, pointing to the book. "To close the gate." Jason's eyes widened as comprehension dawned. "A sacrifice." "Get everyone out," I told him, my decision already made. "I'll seal the gate." "No," Jason protested. "There has to be another way." Around us, the battle had resumed with renewed desperation. The locals fought valiantly against both cultists and the emerging entities, but they were being overwhelmed. More shapes emerged from the darkness, beings not meant to exist in our reality. "There is no other way," I said, gripping Jason's shoulders. "If that gate stays open, what happened to your father will happen to everyone. These things will spread beyond this mountain." Tears streamed down Jason's face. "It should be me. My father caused this." "No," I cut him off. "You need to tell the world what happened here. Make sure this never happens again." I pressed my car keys into his palm. "Now go." With a final anguished look, Jason turned and ran toward the escape route, shouting for the locals to retreat. I watched him go, a strange calm settling over me despite the chaos. I turned to face the darkness, the book clutched in my trembling hands. I began to recite the words Eduardo had translated for me earlier, an ancient incantation meant to reverse the opening of the gate. La Dama noticed me immediately. Her inhuman features contorted with what might have been rage as she abandoned her current victim and moved toward me with unnatural speed. I continued the incantation, my voice growing stronger with each word. The ground trembled more violently. The darkness at the cave entrance pulsed like a living thing, contracting and expanding with each phrase I spoke. La Dama reached for me, her fingers inches from my face, when Eduardo appeared beside me, flinging the contents of multiple pouches directly at her. She recoiled, her form seeming to smoke and dissolve where the mixture touched her. Eduardo grabbed my arm. "The final words must be spoken from within," he shouted above the growing rumble of the earth. "You must enter the darkness." I nodded, understanding. With the book held before me like a shield, I stepped toward the pulsing void. La Dama had recovered and lunged for me again, but Eduardo intercepted her, sacrificing himself to give me the seconds I needed. I didn't look back. I continued the incantation as I approached the threshold of darkness. The final words formed on my lips as I stepped into the void. Cold beyond imagination engulfed me. I felt my body stretching, compressing, existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Through the distortion, I managed to speak the final words of the ritual. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The darkness contracted violently, pulling me deeper as it began to close in on itself. I caught one last glimpse of the outside world, Jason at the edge of the ravine, watching in horror as the gate collapsed. Then there was only darkness and a sensation of falling that seemed to last forever. I should have died in that moment. By all rights, I did die. But death, I discovered, is not the end when you're trapped between worlds. What I experienced in that liminal space defies description. Time had no meaning. I witnessed realities fold into each other like pages of a book. I saw the history of our world from perspectives never meant for human comprehension. And I learned the truth about the beings we had encountered, ancient intelligences that had ruled Earth eons before humans evolved, banished to another dimension by forces equally incomprehensible. They had been trying to return for millennia, using human greed and ambition as tools to pry open the gates between worlds. I don't know how long I remained in that state. Years could have passed in moments, or moments stretched into centuries. All I know is that eventually, impossibly, I found myself lying on the floor of a hospital room, gasping for breath as medical staff rushed to attend to me. Later, I learned I'd been missing for 3 weeks. Search parties had found no trace of me or any of the others who had disappeared that night. The official report claimed a landslide had sealed the cave, burying whoever had been inside. The sudden appearance of a man given up for dead was attributed to amnesia, and exposure a convenient explanation for those who couldn't face the truth. Jason was waiting when I regained consciousness fully. The haunted look in his eyes told me he had aged far more than 3 weeks in my absence. "You died," he said simply. "I saw you die." "I did," I confirmed, "but not completely. He didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer them. Some knowledge is too heavy to share. The gate, I asked instead." "Closed," Jason replied. "Whatever you did worked. The cave collapsed entirely. Ground-penetrating radar shows nothing but solid rock where the entrance used to be. And the others, Ladama, the Gatekeepers." A shadow crossed his face. "Some escaped, most didn't. As for Ladama and the others, they disappeared when the gate closed. At least they disappeared from that location." I understood the implication immediately. "There are other gates," Jason nodded grimly. "Many others. I've been going through my father's files. Our company facilitated the purchase of similar properties across the country, all near locations with legends of doorways or thin spots between worlds. Your father's partners will continue his work." I realized aloud. They already are, Jason confirmed. But now we know what to look for. "We can fight them." He showed me documents he'd compiled, evidence of the Gatekeepers' activities dating back decades. Property transactions, mysterious disappearances, rituals performed at sites across the country. "What happens now?" I asked. Jason's expression hardened with determination. "Now we hunt them down, all of them, before they can open another gate." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of purpose despite the horror we had witnessed. Something had changed within me during my time in the void. I had returned different, aware of realities most humans never glimpse. As Jason prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Jack, what was it like on the other side?" I considered the question carefully. How could I describe the indescribable? How could I explain what it meant to exist outside of conventional reality, to perceive dimensions beyond our limited three? "Cold," I finally said. "Colder than you can imagine, and not empty, never empty." Jason seemed to understand that was all I could offer. He nodded once and left, carrying the burden of knowledge that would define the rest of his life. That night, alone in my hospital room, I sensed a presence. Not threatening, not yet, but watching, assessing. I knew then that my connection to what lay beyond the gate hadn't been severed completely. Part of me remained there, and part of there had returned with me. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked wrong somehow, the angles of my face slightly off, my movements a millisecond behind my intentions. And in certain lights I could swear my knees bent just a little differently than before. Part 4. Shadows that Follow. 3 months after the incident at the mountain, I was finally released from the hospital. The doctors called my recovery miraculous given my condition when I was found severely dehydrated, malnourished with multiple fractures and internal injuries consistent with a fall. What they couldn't explain were the strange anomalies in my blood work, the occasional electrical disruptions that occurred in my room, or why my core body temperature remained several degrees below normal despite having no symptoms of hypothermia. Jason visited regularly throughout my recovery, bringing updates on his investigation into the Gatekeepers. He'd taken control of his father's company after Thomas was declared missing, using the resources to track the cult's activities across the country. Several properties previously handled by Crestwood Properties had been linked to similar geological formations, caves, sinkholes, and other natural features that local legends associated with paranormal activity. "They're regrouping," Jason told me during his final visit before my discharge. "The leadership structure is fractured after what happened at the mountain, but they're still active. I've identified at least 7 other potential gates they're monitoring." I nodded, unsurprised. During my time in the void, I'd glimpsed the vast network of weak points in reality, places where the membrane between dimensions had grown thin through natural processes or deliberate manipulation. The gate we'd closed was just one of many. "And La Dama?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Jason's expression darkened. "There have been sightings, not just in the mountains but in other locations. Different descriptions, but always the same: wrongness." I understood what he meant. The entities weren't bound to a single physical form. They adopted approximations of human appearance, some better than others, but could never quite hide their fundamental alienness. The apartment I returned to felt both familiar and strange, like a childhood home revisited after decades away. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, yet nothing felt quite right. Spaces seemed slightly larger or smaller than I remembered. Colors appeared muted, as if viewed through a thin gray film. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional creaking of pipes or settling of foundations that now sounded uncomfortably like distant whispers. That first night alone, I dreamed of the void. In the dream, I was still falling, surrounded by geometries that shouldn't exist, witnessing events that hadn't yet occurred. I saw gates opening simultaneously across the world. I saw humanity transformed, subjugated by beings they had foolishly invited in, and I saw myself watching it all unfold from some liminal space between realities. I woke drenched in cold sweat, the bedroom temperature near freezing despite the summer heat outside. The digital clock beside my bed flashed 3:33 a.m. repeatedly, even after I unplugged it. In the bathroom, I splashed water on my face, avoiding my reflection out of habit. During my hospital stay, I'd become increasingly disturbed by what I saw in mirrors, subtle distortions that others couldn't perceive. Sometimes my movement has seemed slightly desynchronized from my intentions. Sometimes my features looked just a fraction of an inch out of place. But tonight, something compelled me to look up. The face that stared back was superficially mine. The same dark hair, the same brown eyes, the same stubble along my jaw. Yet, fundamentally, wrong. The eyes blinked a millisecond after I did. The mouth curved into a smile I wasn't forming. "You brought something back," the reflection said, its lips moving independently of mine. I stumbled backward, knocking toiletries from the counter. When I gathered the courage to look again, my reflection behaved normally, mimicking my horrified expression with perfect synchronization. Sleep became impossible after that. I sat in my living room until dawn lights, blazing television murmuring in the background to ward off the silence. As sunlight gradually filled the apartment, I convinced myself the incident had been a hallucination, a side effect of trauma and medication. I maintained this comforting fiction for almost a week. Then the packages started arriving. The first appeared on my doorstep without explanation, no delivery notification, no record of purchase. Inside was a small wooden figurine carved from dark, dense wood I couldn't identify. It depicted a humanoid shape with elongated limbs and a featureless face similar to the twig dolls I'd seen surrounding the altar in the forest. I immediately threw it in the trash. The next day it was back on my kitchen table. I burned it, watching until nothing remained but ash, which I flushed down the toilet. 3 days later, I found it sitting on my pillow, slightly larger than before, with crude facial features now carved into its blank head. After the fifth time destroying it only to have it reappear in increasingly disturbing configurations, I gave up and placed it on my mantel. The manifestations stopped temporarily. Then came the notebooks. I would wake to find pages of text, written in my handwriting, that I had no memory of producing. The contents were mostly incomprehensible, complex mathematical equations, diagrams of impossible structures, and paragraphs in languages that linguists later confirmed didn't match any known human tongue. Occasionally, there were lucid passages, warnings about specific dates and locations, where the gatekeepers would attempt rituals, detailed descriptions of entity behaviors, methods to identify those who had been possessed or replaced. I forwarded these to Jason, who used them to disrupt several ceremonies before they could be completed. "How do you know these things?" he asked during one of our infrequent meetings. We had taken to conversing in public parks, away from electronic devices and potential surveillance. "I don't," I told him honestly. "I write them while asleep." He studied me carefully, concern evident in his expression. "Jack, are you still you?" The question hit me like a physical blow because I'd been asking myself the same thing with increasing frequency. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me never came back from the void, and I think something else filled the empty space." Jason nodded, slowly, unsurprised by my answer. "The elders in Pinecrest warned this might happen. They have stories about others who returned from encounters with Los que vinieron antes. Changed." "Am I dangerous?" I asked, genuinely uncertain. "I don't think so," Jason replied. "Whatever's happening, you're helping us fight them. Maybe that's why you were allowed to return at all." His words offered little comfort. The idea that my return had been permitted, perhaps even engineered by the entities, was deeply unsettling. The changes accelerated after that conversation. I began experiencing periods of missing time hours, or sometimes days, where I had no memory of my actions. I would find myself in unfamiliar locations with no recollection of how I'd arrived. Hotel receipts for rooms I didn't remember booking, gas station charges from states I had never intentionally visited. After one such episode, I returned to awareness in a motel room in New Mexico, surrounded by walls covered in elaborate symbols drawn in what appeared to be charcoal. A map was pinned to the center, marked with dozens of locations across the country, each corresponding to a potential gate. Most disturbing of all, the room contained numerous files and photographs documenting members of the Gatekeepers, their identities, movements, and connections. Many were prominently displayed business leaders, politicians, and celebrities whose involvement with a death cult would seem inconceivable to the general public. I gathered everything and sent it to Jason before checking out of the motel. As I drove back east, a strange calm settled over me. Whatever was happening, whatever I was becoming, seemed to have a purpose beyond my understanding. 2 days ago, everything changed again. I received a text message from Jason containing only GPS coordinates and the words, "They're opening all of them." I immediately recognized the location, a cave system in Kentucky that had featured prominently in my automatic writings. I've spent the last 48 hours driving nonstop, sleeping only when my body absolutely demands it. The coordinates are now just 20 miles ahead. But something is wrong. For the past hour, my phone has been receiving texts from Jason's number that make no sense, strings of characters that aren't in any language I recognize, interspersed with fragments of English that seem cut from different conversations. They're in my head. Found the connection between all gates, dimensional geometry, predates not Jason anymore. The last message received moments ago was the most coherent. "Don't come. They wanted you back for a reason. You're the key that opens all doors at once. They're in me now, but fighting. Destroy your phone and run." I pull over to the shoulder of the empty highway, my hands shaking as I read the message again. The implications are clear. Jason has been compromised, and I'm being lured into a trap. But why me? What makes me different from any other sacrifice? Then I remember what Eduardo said about the ritual to close the gate. It required someone to enter willingly. I had done exactly that, offering myself to seal the passage. But instead of dying, I had returned, changed. The realization hits me with sickening clarity. I didn't close the gate permanently. I became the gate. In the rearview mirror, my reflection smiles with a mouth that isn't moving in sync with my frozen expression of horror. Behind me on the empty back seat, I catch a glimpse of something impossible. A pale face framed by dark hair, the familiar distorted smile of La Dama. "We found you," my reflection says, its voice overlapping with my unmoving lips. "The opener of ways, the bridge between worlds." I fumble for the door handle, desperate to escape the confines of the car, but my hand won't obey. My body feels increasingly foreign, my control over it slipping away like water through cupped fingers. In the distance, I see headlights approaching, 3 sets evenly spaced, moving at identical speeds, black SUVs. My phone buzzes one final time. Not a text from Jason, but a notification from a news app I don't remember installing. Unprecedented meteor shower expected tonight. Astronomers baffled by simultaneous celestial event visible worldwide. The reflection in my mirror laughs, a sound I recognize from those terrible nights at the cabin. My mouth forms words I'm not speaking. The stars are right. All doors will open. What was banished will return. I focus every remaining ounce of will into my right hand, managing to reach the door handle. As it swings open, I throw myself from the still-running vehicle, tumbling painfully across the asphalt. The approaching SUVs accelerate, their engines roaring in unison. Running is pointless. They'll find me wherever I go because I carry their passage inside me. But perhaps there's another option, one final sacrifice. I stumble toward the steep ravine beside the highway. If my body is the gate, then perhaps destroying it will prevent what's coming. It's a desperate gamble, but the only one I have left. As I reach the edge, I look up at the night sky. The meteor shower has begun, streaks of light crisscrossing the darkness. But they're not falling toward Earth. They're emerging from it, shooting upward like luminous creatures escaping the depths of the ocean. I close my eyes and step forward into empty air. The impact never comes. Instead, I feel the familiar cold of the void enveloping me, stretching my consciousness across dimensions. But this time, I'm not alone. Countless others are here, all those who disappeared through gates across history, suspended in this liminal space between worlds. And beyond us, watching with ancient patience, they wait for the doors to open fully. My phone, still clutched in my hand despite the impossible physics of this non-place, buzzes one last time. The screen displays a simple message from a number I don't recognize. The cabin was just the beginning. Every home is a doorway now. As awareness fades, I sense a final truth: I never left that mountain cave. What returned was something else entirely, wearing my face, carrying their purpose. The real Jack Reyes is still falling through the void and will fall forever. And the thing that wears his skin is already reaching for the doorknob of your home.